Welcome to MrClaff.com's review of the Cold War, brought to you by Noble Review, concise review books. The Cold War was fought, or not fought, between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. Although no bullets were directly fired at each other during the Cold War, puppet wars occurred as the United States fought communism around the globe. After Stalin received control over much of Eastern Europe in the Yalta Conference of World War II, there was an obvious divide. U.S. diplomat George Kennan coined the term containment, which means to stop the spread of communism. Containment is the opposite of appeasement, or giving in to the aggressor's desires. Here are some basic differences between the United States and Soviet Union. The United States wanted to contain communism, rebuild Eastern Europe to provide new markets for trade, and reunite Germany. The Soviets wanted to spread communism, control Eastern Europe to protect Soviet borders, and keep Germany divided. There are so many examples of containment to know. The Truman Doctrine gave military aid without troops to countries resisting communism. Greece and Turkey took advantage of this aid. Secretary of State George Marshall's plan gave economic aid to countries. The idea was to make nations stronger so they would be less susceptible to communist takeovers. About $12.5 billion in aid was given. There was much brinkmanship during the Cold War, or going to the brink of war without fighting. In 1948, Joseph Stalin blockaded highways and railroads going into West Berlin. He hoped to make West Berlin dependent upon him and his satellites for supplies. However, the United States and Great Britain flew approximately 277,000 flights full of provisions for the people. Despite Stalin's anger, no bullets were fired. The two gangs of the Cold War were NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact, which was more commonly known as the Communist Bloc. In 1957, the Soviets sent a satellite into outer space called Sputnik. Though it wasn't too sophisticated, it made Americans nervous about Soviet technology. In addition, it led to an increase of American spending on education and science. In 1969, the United States won the space race to the moon. The Cold War had its share of paranoia. In 1960, the American U-2 spy plane was shot out of the Soviet sky, thus displaying that distrust in espionage was real. During the conservative 1950s, the United States government targeted potential communists in the government. You need to know about Senator Joseph McCarthy. McCarthyism was a witch hunt that looked to sniff out communists within government and society. Similarly, HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, also looked to arrest suspected communists. They targeted government official Alger Hiss, who was found guilty of perjury when he denied being a communist spy. Accused of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the first civilians ever to be executed for their treasonous crimes. In 1961, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev put a formal divide between communist East Berlin and non-communist West Berlin. This was the Berlin Wall. President Kennedy traveled to the wall and delivered his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. It is disputed that what Kennedy said was translated into I am a donut. He more so wanted to tell the West Berliners that Americans were against this wall. Similarly, President Reagan went to the wall and gave a speech in 1987, hoping to tear it down. The wall was a symbol of communism and did not come down until 1989. The following year was the peak of the Cold War, and nearly World War III. Fidel Castro became the communist leader of Cuba, which was just 90 miles from the United States. Having communism so close was not in America's interest, so President Kennedy looked to topple Castro's regime. However, the rebels that the United States sponsored were defeated at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. This only led to worse tension between the United States and Cuba and strengthened the communist alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Thus, Soviet missiles arrived in Cuba and were pointed towards the United States. This escalated into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy's solution was to blockade, or quarantine, Cuba so that no Soviet weapons could get in. He also threatened to invade if the missiles were not removed. Ultimately, cooler heads prevailed, and Khrushchev pulled out the missiles contingent on the United States removing some of theirs from Turkey. Two wars were fought in Korea and Vietnam. During these wars, the concept of containment was applied to Asia. Both were undeclared wars. This was echoed by the domino theory, which aimed to stop a chain reaction after one country fell to communism. In Korea, the United Nations voted to send troops after communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and attacked non-communist South Korea. Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur from command as MacArthur challenged Truman's decisions as commander-in-chief. The 38th parallel was restored at the end of the war and still is the dividing line of these two nations. For Vietnam, you need to know that the United States got involved after the French allowed Dien Bien Phu to fall to Ho Chi Minh and the Communists in 1954. After gradually increasing troop levels, President Johnson escalated the war further after the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. The United States never had a hold on this war, and the Tet Offensive was a massive thrust southward by the Communists in the North. Decreased American morale led to great protests within the United States, as singers such as Phil Ochs and Bob Dylan protested the war, as did many hippies. Protests turned violent at Kent State University in 1970 when the Ohio National Guard fired on students, killing 4. Most protesters against the war were young, as they were the ones susceptible to the draft law. President Nixon gradually removed troops in the 1970s and ultimately pulled out in 1973. The 1970s saw a détente, or an easing of Cold War tensions. You need to know about SALT, which looked to limit nuclear missiles. President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev were rather cordial together. This was a far cry from the days of Truman and Stalin. Ronald Reagan abandoned détente in favor of spending more on defense with programs such as Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Communism began to fall by the late 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev. His programs of glasnost's openness and perestroika's economic restructuring opened the door for the collapse of the Soviet Union. After a failed August coup in 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and communism further deteriorated all over Eastern Europe. Here again are the major examples of containment. For more review, you can get free flashcards and review sheets at MrClaff.com. We also invite you to check out Noble Review in both paperback and ebook formats. Best of luck on your tests.